Hello and welcome back to our Sunday reading. We have Mr. Benjamin Banks on the floor, and he has been looking out the window and has already been getting into the chords. So once again, if I stop unexpectedly or the whole thing starts to fall over, you know who's around. Mr. Bermuda is completely asleep and I believe on the bed at the moment, so he got worn out with some tussling earlier, so that's how it is. Fun times. Alright, oh, and then we'll have a little personal story time at the end that you don't have to stick around for if you don't want. But anyway, here is chapter 33, Mr. Tubbles. The first person I saw was Annabeth, and I felt something inside me relax and sing for joy. I was home. Annabeth was my little Miss Sunshine, the person who sat by my side most of the time while I was recovering from my death experience. She'd sat with me again after I was pummeled by Isabel, and we'd really become best friends when Sandy and John had played Sleeping Beauty and Cave of Wonders. Her cheerful optimism was the foundation of our crew, and I was so glad to see her again. I dropped my luggage and picked her up in a big hug. She laughed and gave me a classic Annabeth squeeze right back. I put her down and took a good look at her. "Damn, girl, you are packing some muscle," I told her playfully, and she really was too. When I'd first seen her, she'd been a little round grandma. She was still little, but she wasn't so round anymore. All those hours training at the beach were starting to show. Her hugs still had all their classic warmth, but now they had some real power too. John was next. This time it was my turn to get hoisted up, or get swept up, as he hoisted me into the air and gave me a proper mountain troll squeeze. I'm sure I looked like one of those hamsters when you hold them too hard and their eyes all go bugging out. "My brother from another mother," he exclaimed, squeezing me again. I felt my ribs creak, and when he finally put me down, I was seeing stars. John was all man, and sometimes he forgot his own strength. My magical sight had already spotted him behind John as soon as I stepped into the room, but once I got my breath back, I turned to Tyler. My boyfriend. My heart was suddenly so full I thought it would explode. My eyes drank in his smooth brown skin, his warm chocolate eyes, his wicked smile. It almost didn't seem real. This moment was finally here. He was real, I was real, and we were together again. It was only a week, but it had felt like a lifetime since I'd last seen him. I cried as I crossed the distance between us. I probably looked like someone in a rom-com movie, but I didn't care. I kissed him and his lips were real. I wrapped myself around him. His warmth was real. His muscles were somehow both hard and soft at the same time. I tasted him. I ran my fingers through his hair, felt his touch on my body. Oh God, I was in heaven. I don't know how long it was, but I finally became aware there were other people in the room. It was long enough for Sandy to have put her luggage aside and made herself a cup of coffee. "We'll pick this up later," he whispered. Then we made some coffee for ourselves and joined the group. For the next few hours we just sat and told stories about the gathering. So much had happened and there was so much to tell. Sandy still didn't have her pantry stocked back to normal levels yet, so Annabeth made us all sandwiches. I loved mine, but it drove home the fact that we were back to normal living again. No more would there be carts that just appeared, loaded with all kinds of exotic foods. The only thing of real excitement that had happened with the home crew was suddenly getting the mark of the deep earth. That had been a shock. Other than that, life had been quiet. Nobody had attacked the house, and they hadn't found any rotten mages to take out. John was working on a new ring, and Annabeth had been training on the beach. She was now a low student in punching, and her level was 27.8. I was completely shocked. I was level 10.3, and the last time we'd compared notes, she was 9.4. I hadn't tested my punching with sparkles in a while, but still, she was doing awesome. She was also now a low student in the arena, and her level was 63. Mine was only 31. I jumped up and gave her a congratulatory hug, of course, and told her just how proud I was of her. "So how did you improve so quickly?" I asked. "You were always great at training, but that shouldn't have given you gains like that." "You'll have to wait and see," she said mysteriously. "Oh, looks like I wasn't the only person to figure out new things," I said playfully. "The Grand Matron did say that Sonic mages were highly versatile," Sandy pointed out. "Yes, but versatility doesn't exactly mean powerful," Annabeth says. "It does mean you can both top and bottom, though," I said playfully. Annabeth just looked confused as Tyler kicked my ankle. Kidding aside, Annabeth's progress made me anxious to find out exactly what variation of the Force Rune I needed. Add it to Red in his Hex network, and then see what arena level I could get up to. Sandy was ready to get settled in, so we decided to meet the following night for an official dinner. She was going to use some of her new stasis trays she'd bought at the fair and see how they worked out. Sandy loved to cook, so she didn't need an excuse to go all culinary for us, but she had one anyway. Tyler and I left Sandy's place, holding hands and trailing my luggage behind us. He mentioned that he had been staying at my place while I was gone and hoped that was okay. Apparently he'd really miss me, and being around my stuff was the next best thing. That was so sweet. I just melted. He was trying to tell me more, but I had so many feels going through me I couldn't focus. On one hand, my heart was deep in the feels. I wanted to hold his hand, listen to his voice, and burst into song. On the other hand, my body wanted to smash with him in the worst way possible. I was trying not to come across as too much, but I was thirsty. I was so thirsty, like 7 days in the desert thirsty. All that centaur's sexual energy from last night rushed through me. I almost made it to my apartment before my needs grew to biblical proportions. As the good book says, my loins were on fire. I dropped the handle of my suitcase and turned to say something witty, but all that came out was a growl. Tyler's eyes twinkled, like he knew exactly how hard it had been for me to even make it this far, and between one blink and the next, he was naked. I picked his beautiful naked body up and sprinted towards the door, growling the whole way. Forget biblical, I was going caveman. I wanted to make it to the bed, but that didn't happen. At least we made it to the bedroom. I wanted to save my clothes too, but that didn't happen either. Somehow they got ripped off and fell to the floor. In the world of gay love, I'm a bottom. There's nothing I love more than having my man working his magic on top of me. Sometimes, though, when the need is great enough, I turn into a powerful, demanding top, and this was one of those times. Tyler howled with joy as we hit the floor. I knew he lived for moments like this with me. He likes my playful side, but my caveman side really turns him on, as his body demonstrated to my utter glee. We had no lube though, and my brain wasn't functioning at a high enough level to get any. I was too damn big to fit without lube, but I wasn't going to let him go. He wrapped his arms and legs around me as my hips ground our dicks together in the space between us. His lips nibbled my neck and I just lost it. The stimulation was too much. I clung to him and shook as my long, thick fireman laid down his milkshake. I'm very aware those analogies don't belong together, but I just don't care. If I was a normal person, that would have lowered the temperature of our lovemaking by a lot. I'd have gotten soft for a while and we'd have had a moment to recover. I wasn't normal though. I was a supernatural god and I was still thirsty. "Grrr," I said in caveman, and Tyler nodded eagerly. At least we had something slick to use as lube now. I was still so hard I pulsed as I slid home inside him. Fortunately, my extreme need was sated a bit, so I lasted longer this time. I still wasn't ready to pull out yet, and Tyler was still having way too much fun, so I decided the third time's the charm and went for it. My brain cleared up enough for me to upgrade from caveman to Italian lover, and I started using some of those fancy techniques Tyler normally used on me. He moaned in appreciation as his hands urged me on. Faster, harder, they said, but instead I slowed down. I wanted to truly appreciate this homecoming in all its glory and milk it for all it was worth. Pun intended. We had lovely, delicious floor sex until I felt him tightening up. He got extra hard and I picked up the pace. He came first and I was right behind him. It was a beautiful slice of heaven and I collapsed on top of him. We both started laughing, although neither of us had said anything funny. It was just the joy of life and the wonder of being together in the best way possible. We finally broke apart, got some water, and then I ran out into the hallway to get my luggage. My shredded clothes were still lying on the floor, and I sadly picked them up and threw them away. Then I decided to unpack. When we opened the suitcase, I discovered my casual clothes had been beautifully folded like works of art. Whichever centaur had packed for me had done a wonderful job. As we put my clothes away, Tyler noticed my manscaping. I told him the story about standing there in my birthday suit while the centaurs trimmed me up to perfection. I think the story about all that manly touching turned him on as he started running his fingers through my hair. And I'm not talking about the hair on top of my head. That turned me on, and suddenly all that centaur lust hit me again. This time, though, we made it to the bed like civilized people. I lost track of how many ways we did it and who came how often, so let's just say Tyler worked his breathtaking incubus magic. The best thing was that we affirmed we belonged with each other. When I gave my final quivering gasps and collapsed totally spent, I smelled like Tyler and he smelled like me. My hands, my lips, my sweat had been all over his body. I cleaned him as mine and he'd claimed me as his. It was a wonderful feeling and I was so happy I almost cried. We lay there for a while, letting my giant ceiling fan cool us down before Tyler revealed he had a surprise. He told me to hang on a sec and disappeared into the bathroom. A few minutes later he reappeared and led me inside. He'd strewn rose petals on the floor leading up to our whirlpool tub and lit candles all around it. The jets were on low and the hot tub bubbled softly. The whole scene was as romantic as a novel, and my gay heart gave a happy squee. I'd never actually used this whirlpool tub before. I'd always been short on time, so I'd always used the walk-through shower. I settled in first, and the hot water felt delightful. I felt so light, like I was going to float up like a bubble. Tyler settled in next, facing the opposite way. This tub was really built for two people. There was plenty of room, and by alternating orientation, it was easy to see and talk to each other. We were also close together, so I laid my arm over his leg and stroked the inside of his thigh. It was intimate and lovely, and for a moment we just soaked and existed together. Then we talked about the gathering and my fight with the centaur guard. His feet were right there, so I lifted one out of the water and put it on my chest. Then I added some liquid soap and gave him a foot massage while we talked. He moaned with pleasure and scooched down a bit more to give me plenty of access. It felt nice to do something with my hands while we were talking. I was so used to him touching me that I didn't notice at first, but then I realized he was fondling my balls. He was gently rolling them over and over in his hand like they were a pair of dice. I was surprised at just how good it felt. It was really soothing. It was like he was singing me a lullaby. I started massaging his other foot and he shifted so he had better access. My goodness, that felt good. Who knew my jewels were such a happy place? If he hadn't already drained every bit of joy juice out of me, it would have made me horny. As it was, though, it just felt calming and reassuring. I told him how protective the Grand Matron had been. If I broke him, she was gonna be after me. He just laughed and said it was nice she still thought of him. I also said we needed to talk about his situation. I needed to know what it was and how I could help support him. "We will certainly talk about it," he said quietly, "but I'd rather not get into it right now. I'm safe in the house, so there's no hurry, and I'll need to be in the right mood to tell the story. Just know that you are supporting me in the best way possible. Every time we laugh together or do something normal together, you're helping me recover. Even these missions the house sends me on helps me get back to who I used to be. I've gotten in a good space mentally and emotionally, and I'm just grateful, and I'm grateful every day that I get to heal a little more with you." He smiled at me, and it was the type of smile where his eyes lit up with kindness. "You're easy to be with, Jason, and I appreciate that so much. I love how excited you get about figuring out new things and how hard you work at succeeding. You have a good balance, though. You're not too focused on any one thing. There's room for me in your life, but you're not dependent on me. Being with you feels welcoming, and I love that." For a long moment we just existed together, chatting and touching and enjoying being with each other once again. Finally I was starting to wrinkle up, and it was time to get out. Tubs are fun to lounge in, but they aren't that great for getting you clean, so we both ended up taking a shower. Tyler told me to just relax and put my hands in the air, and he'd do all the work. He kissed me, soaped me up, and then caressed every part of me in his quest to make sure I was sanitary. I laughed, kissed him back, and thanked him for his diligent service. He finished it off by toweling me dry and then carrying me to bed. He tucked me into my giant four-poster bed, told me he'd take care of the bathroom and that he'd be back in a moment. He was just starting to head off when the bottom of the bed bounced a bit. I looked down, expecting to see Bermuda, but my magic sight already knew that it wasn't. My visitor only had 3 legs, 1 eye, and a chewed-up ear. He was a short-haired, orange tabby cat, and he looked rough. Clearly, life had not been kind to him. I knew immediately who this had to be, Tyler's shy and elusive furry companion. "Hello, Mr. Tubbles," I said kindly. "Welcome to my home. I'm so glad you're here." I shot Tyler a questioning glance, and he quickly filled me in. "I've been spending a lot of time here, and one day he decided to come and check out this place for himself. You and Bermuda weren't present, so I guess he decided to make himself at home. I hope that is okay." He sounded worried, like I might get upset or something. "Of course that's okay," I said quietly. I was keeping my tone soft as I was just meeting Mr. Tubbles and I didn't want to startle him. "Mr. Tubbles, I'm so happy to finally meet you, and you are always welcome in my home." He regarded me with his one eye like he knew what I was saying. I reached out my hand so he could get a sniff and say hi if he wanted. He was missing his right front leg and his right eye, but it didn't seem to bother him too much as he hobbled forward and sniffed the tips of my fingers. Then the bed bounced again as Bermuda hopped up from the other side and sat down on his usual pillow. Tyler and I froze and stayed on high alert. This was Bermuda's territory, and I wasn't sure how he's going to react to having another cat in his domain. Bermuda looked at me like, "Calm down, Daddy. Mr. Tubbles isn't going to hurt you. Let's all be civilized and get along." Then he started grooming himself like it was no big deal. I looked back at Mr. Tubbles, but he just hopped over my leg, hobbled over to a pillow on Tyler's side of the bed. Then he sat down and started grooming himself too. Tyler and I slowly relaxed. "I think everything is going to be okay," I said in wonder. "I think so too," he replied. "I thought we'd have a bit more drama than this, but I'm glad it all worked out well." "How did you two meet?" I asked. I heard a lot about Mr. Tubbles, as Tyler loved his little ragamuffin, but it was all current day stuff. Tyler didn't like to talk about his past, and that included his early days with his cat. I'd escaped and I'd been on the run for about a week or two, Tyler said quietly. Then he gave me a look that said he knew he was leaving out a lot of the story, but he wasn't ready to tell it yet. I waved at him like, no problem, keep going. And he did. I had no money and no one to call for help. I hadn't seen anyone after me for a few days, but I knew they wouldn't stop looking. I needed to just disappear, and that is what I did. I happened upon an alley that was really the backyard of an old warehouse. They had a dump spot where they'd thrown a bunch of old furniture, and there was a place between a stack of sofas and a few chairs that stayed relatively warm and dry. What really made this place wonderful was the back of an all-you-could-eat Chinese buffet. It wasn't the cleanest place, and they would throw their leftover food into the alley at the end of the night. Once the restaurant closed and the lights went out, I fought out the raccoons, possums, and anyone else I needed in order to get a meal. "So you met Mr. Tubbles fighting for food?" I asked. "Oh no," he laughed. "The nice dry spot I found in the sofas already had a resident, and Mr. Tubbles was not happy about sharing his home. He changed his tune, though, when I started sharing my Chinese leftovers with him. Since he couldn't fight anymore, he usually was one of the last alley residents to eat. Since he shared his home, I shared my food, and it wasn't long before we became the best friends." "That sounds like quite the story," I said. I know what it's like to be on your own, trying to survive. I also know how awesome it is to find a warm, dry place to hole up. I didn't have anybody chasing me, though, so it's not the same. I'm sure a lot of people would think that was just awful for you, but it sounds to me like you made it work." He nodded with a far-off look in his eyes. In some ways, they were the happiest days of my life. I was free, I had food and shelter, and I finally had a friend. I think that's why we connected so well. Life had been rough for both of us, but we were survivors, and we found out that life was better together. "So how long did you stay there?" I asked. "I think it was a couple months," he said. "I needed time to heal, both physically and magically. Plus, there wasn't anywhere I needed to be. The search was still ongoing, I'm sure, but there were no cameras in the alley and nobody went back there. So I was as safe as I could be. I felt touches of magic every now and then, but I just hunkered down and blended in. When I finally moved on, Mr. Tubbles came with me. I thought it would slow me down, but he ended up being a big help. People noticed him instead of me, so I was able to remain conspicuous a while longer. Also, cat people are good people, and they would take one look at him and make sure we had food or sometimes a couple bucks for the road. Mr. Tubbles was also the one that found the house. One day he just led me up to this old mansion and walked inside. I wondered what the hell he was doing and walked in after him. I haven't left the house since. "Wow," I said. "It sounds like Mr. Tubbles knew what he was doing." I turned to address him directly. "Mr. Tubbles, thank you for taking care of Tyler. I know he appreciates it, and so do I." I was being playful, but I was also being serious. I knew firsthand how a furry friend could heal your world and make everything better. Tyler had said he needed magical and physical healing. I think he needed emotional healing too, and Mr. Tubbles had been the perfect ragged physician. Mr. Tubbles stopped licking his paw to regard me with his one good eye. "You are welcome," he seemed to say. Then he went back to grooming. Tyler stayed with me for a few minutes longer, then left to clean the bathroom and blow out the candles. I'm pretty sure the house wasn't going to burn down, but there was no sense in tempting fate. I snuggled down into my bed, and Bermuda rolled over and snuggled up with me. I rubbed his belly as the giant fan overhead slowly turned on its long axis. The windows above the bed let in the peaceful sounds of the ocean. That should be impossible since we were in Louisville, Kentucky, and the ocean was many hundreds of miles away. Nothing was impossible in this house, though. and it had made this amazing bedroom just for me. It was so peaceful I was almost asleep when Tyler came back to bed and snuggled up with me. His naked body pressed up against my back as his arms wrapped around me. Our legs naturally tangled together, and his warm breath flowed across my neck. This was heaven, pure, wonderful heaven, and I spent several long minutes enjoying it. Something tickled my brain about the evening, though. I'd never had a cat before, but nothing about Bermuda up to this point had suggested that he would tolerate another feline in his space. I was very glad Mr. Tubbles was here, as I'd always felt a bit guilty when Tyler was spending time with me instead of his furry baby. Now we could all be together and nobody would be left out. I thought about that for a while, letting the sleepy thoughts rest in my mind. Finally, I registered what my magical senses were telling me. My magical sight could see Mr. Tubbles as he scooted closer to Tyler, but I couldn't see inside Mr. Tubbles. I couldn't see his muscles and bones and exactly what his injuries were on the inside. Every living thing has an aura which protects them, but my sight had gotten a lot stronger. I should have been able to see inside a regular cat. It might be blurry and maybe I couldn't zoom in that much, but I should still be able to see something. I focused my sight and really looked. Nothing. He was a black hole. I tried again, but this time I pushed hard. I pushed hard and this time I pushed. I pushed hard, and this time I saw something. He was filled with magic, and it was sky blue. I double-checked Tyler's magic. It was the same color. That could only mean that they'd shared magic, and that could only mean that Mr. Tubbles was a companion as well. No wonder they'd gotten along so nicely. Satisfied that all was well, I quickly fell asleep. I woke up to something soft and furry touching my face. I opened my eyes, but I already knew what I would see. Bermuda was full of energy and ready to play. His ears were up, his eyes were wide, his tail was twitching in anticipation of what was coming. I sighed, rubbed his head, and summoned the Dot 3.0. I held Bermuda back for just a sec to give him a head start. Dot gave a toot-toot and took off with Bermuda in hot pursuit. The bedroom was filled with the sounds of a cat gone wild, but that didn't bother me. I closed my eyes and dozed peacefully until I felt a set of whiskers brush my face. That seemed strange. I could still hear Bermuda playing. I opened my eyes, and there was Mr. Tubbles peering at me from about 2 inches away. Once he saw he had my attention, he backed up and sat down. "Well, hello there," I said softly. I didn't want to wake Tyler up, although he seemed to be able to sleep through almost anything. "Do you want some love?" No, he did not want love. Instead, he looked at me, then looked at Bermuda, then looked at me again. Then he sat there expectantly, willing for me to get the message and do something. "Do you want to play?" I asked, and he bobbed his head in anticipation. Does this cat understand English? Surely not. He was probably responding to the tone in my voice. He looked at Bermuda racing across the bedroom again and then looked at me. "You can't see my magic," I explained. "Only Bermuda, Penny, and Eggy can see my magic." He let me know he didn't care. Bermuda was playing and he wanted to too. "Okay," I sighed, "I'll make you a dot. Just don't get mad at me if you can't play with it." He bobbed his head and stared at me intently. "Alrighty then, 1 dot coming up." I couldn't make a Dot 3.0 for him though. He couldn't run and jump like Bermuda, and he'd just get frustrated chasing it. What I needed to do was increase the fun factor while slowing the car down. What popped into my head was a very fun car, Herbie the Love Bug from the old Disney movies. Now that was a car with loads of personality. I didn't want it to look exactly identical, though, as a white car would not be that interesting to a cat. I started with the classic round Volkswagen Beetle body. I made the base color sky blue so it matched Tyler's magic, and then I bedazzled the hell out of it. This was going to be a fun car. It needed to do more than sparkle, so I added a red dot like a laser on the back and then added feathers coming off the top. I added eyelashes on the front lights and gave it a big smile on the hood with a red nose. I paused to admire my work. It sort of looked like it was decked out like a Las Vegas showgirl. Hopefully that translated to it being completely irresistible to a cat. I modified the door wings so it could fly, as it needed to be able to get out the bed and fly over obstacles. It didn't need to be fast, so it flew more like a slow ladybug. It looked damn cute though. I added in some tiny details, filled it up with magic, and turned it loose. It rolled its way down the bed, and Mr. Tubbles just sat there, looking at me. I was afraid of this. I had made the perfect toy for him, but he couldn't see it. "I'm sorry, little one," I said gently. "I wish this had worked out." The bedazzled dot rolled back up the bed and stopped beside Mr. Tubbles. He looked at me, looked down at the bed, then looked back up at me again. He seemed to be able to sense that something was there. Then he turned to Bermuda and gave a raspy cry. Meow. Bermuda stopped his wild chase and came over to the bed. They touched noses for a minute, and then Bermuda ran off again. Mr. Tubbles looked down at the bed, and this time I could see he saw his sparkling dot. It rolled down the bed, and this time Mr. Tubbles hobbled after it. The bedazzled dot made it to the end of the bed, spread its doors, and slowly flew off. It didn't get far, though, as Mr. Tubbles caught one of the feathers in his mouth and pulled it back. He had a very satisfied look on his face as he walked over to Tyler's side of the bed, pulling his dot behind him. I watched them both play for a while with my magical sight. Mr. Tubbles was very slow compared to Bermuda, so Bedazzled Dot made sure not to run away too quickly. Many times he just went in circles, waving his feathers in the air and giving Mr. Tubbles a show until he caught up. Satisfied that all was well, I snuggled into Tyler and tried to go back to sleep. I had several lovely, peaceful moments, but sleep just wouldn't come for me. So I ended up getting my phone and checking the time. 3 a.m. I had a long time until morning arrived. I'd really missed having my phone at the gathering, so I turned down the volume and the brightness and just let myself play for a while. I pulled up Sudoku and enjoyed sinking into the logic of the numbers. I wasn't talented in a lot of areas, but my one gift was spotting patterns. I could sense the underlying logic behind things that looked complicated, and that made Sudoku fun for me. I cleared board after board, and it felt nice to do something that wasn't training or fighting someone that was trying to kill me. There was no danger in a game of Sudoku. Much sooner than expected, I started feeling restless, so I switched to Netflix and watched a show. Bermuda finished playing, so he came and snuggled up with me. That left the whole floor for Mr. Tubbles, so he let loose as much as he could and really enjoyed playing with his dot. Unlike Bermuda, he didn't destroy my creation when he caught it, so one bedazzled dot was lasting him a long time. I finished the show and started another one, but again I felt restless. I've been really looking forward to spending as much time as possible just doing normal stuff, but now I'd already done all that and it wasn't even the morning yet. One thing that I hadn't done was check in with my creations, so I slipped out of bed and went into the bathroom. I sent out the call to let them know I was ready, and they swarmed me with love. All the grannies and octopuses wanted to touch me and tell me how much they missed me, all at the same time. I'd certainly missed them too, and I let them know how wonderful it was to be back with them. Before I'd left, I used to check in with my creations multiple times a day to repair their damage and make sure they were doing okay. Now it had been a whole week, and they were looking a little rough for wear. The grannies especially looked rough. They were cleaning the contaminated magic out of the park, so they were constantly getting worn down by the environment. I lost a bunch of them, at least 3/4 of their numbers, and the ones that were left behind were not operating at their best. I took the time to fix them all, make sure they were full of fresh magic, and let them know just how much I appreciated their hard work. "So how's the park doing?" I asked the lead granny. "It is almost clean," she said proudly. We would have been finished already if we'd been at full capacity. With what you've been able to do today, though, we should be finished as early as tonight." "That is just wonderful," I said. "I know the park and everyone who visits it will appreciate all you've done." We talked a bit more, and it sounded like now that the contaminated magic was mostly gone, new growth was already starting to appear. I was very glad to hear that, as I thought it wouldn't start coming back until spring next year. Octa and her tangle were next. They'd stayed in the house, so they weren't in such bad shape, but they still needed love and attention. I gave them all fresh, vibrant magic and told each one of them how much I appreciated them. I decided to make sure the park was finished today, so I went back to the lead granny and gave her lots of magic while she duplicated a whole bunch of new helpers. We doubled their small workforce, and she assured me that there were now plenty of willing hands to make sure the remaining cleaning was easy and fun. The grannies and the octopuses got back to work, and I headed back to bed. I picked up Eggy on the way back. Maybe spending some time with him would calm me down and let me get to sleep again. I snuggled back in beside Tyler, rubbed Bermuda's belly, then hugged Eggy to my chest and sent him a cheerful hello. I heard nothing but silence. That wasn't like Eggy at all. He was always formal in an old-fashioned kind of way, and he always replied back. I dove in for a closer look and saw what the problem was right away. He had too many types of magic in him, and they weren't mixing. His bottom layer of magic was very old, and it was from his original creator. I think it had originally been brown, but now it's just ashy gray. It was hard and brittle, and it wasn't easy to convert. I'd slowly chipped away at it, but it would probably be years before I was able to convert it all. His next layer was the emerald green and sapphire blue of my magic. It was a nice thick layer, as I'd already spent a lot of time working on him, but on top of that was an even thicker layer of neutral magic from the park. The grannies had been working on clearing up the contamination the whole time I'd been gone, and they'd been passing the magic to Octa and her tangle. Per my directions, Octa had given much of the magic to the house, but her tangle had also given Eggy as much as he could absorb. It looks like they'd given him quite a lot. I'd have thought the neutral magic would mix with my magic and he would be just fine. Eggy would end up with less saturated magic overall, but it would still be my magic. That's what happened with Penny, but it wasn't what I was seeing here. Maybe Eggy was different because I hadn't actually created him. Either way, he had a big fat band of neutral magic, and it had put him back to sleep again. To complicate matters even more, there was another layer of sparkly magic on top of that. I could feel Eggy's awareness, and it seemed like that potent mix of power was giving him the human equivalent of a bad stomachache. His awareness surfaced enough to give me a polite greeting. Then I got the impression he was feeling the metal equivalent of throwing up, so he shut back down again. Poor Eggy. I was very glad he'd been able to take all that extra magic from touching the centaurs, but I hadn't known what he was going through and that the extra magic would make it worse. The different magic wasn't mixing though, and after I felt both of them, it was easy to see why. The sparkly magic was like a bunch of drunk frat boys cheering me on. It loved me very much and was solidly on my side, but it was all just a bit too much. The neutral magic, on the other hand, felt like I'd gone in the wrong door to a meeting room and ended up in an Amway presentation. In other words, it felt confused and slightly suspicious. What I needed to do was create a nice middle ground where they could blend together. This ended up being a lot easier than I thought it would be. I zoomed into where the two magics met, got into the right frame of mind, and just started inviting both of them to be my regular type of magic. This technique had worked for me before, and it worked for me again. It started off slowly, which was normal, but once I got a little bit of both sides to mingle, it began to take on a life of its own. I had one big difference this time, the mark of the deep earth. As soon as I started working with Eggy, it woke up and got excited. Metal? Awake? It sounded a bit like Scooby-Doo, and it was eager to help. It took my normal invitation and amplified the heck out of it. I started reaching a larger group of magic, and soon the two groups were hitting it off like I was hosting an ice cream social. Once I had a good spot started, I began zooming over Eggy's magic like I was Superman laying down some heat vision. I'd done this before with both Eggy and Penny, and this was my favorite part. I really felt like I was some magical fairy bringing life and color to the land. I sprinkled my pixie dust, and it wasn't long before Eggy started feeling better and woke up. He was ready to chat, but I wanted to make sure he was in top shape with no tummy issues before I stopped. So I did 3 full passes before I was satisfied. His magic was now a lovely saturated emerald green and sapphire blue with no sparkles to be found. I just finished Eggy when it occurred to me that I hadn't heard from Penny in a while. "Penny," I asked cautiously, "are you okay?" "Dude," she slurred. "I've never, realized before, but, blue is such a deep color." Oh boy, Penny was drunk on magic. Really, man, wow, it's so green too." She trailed off. I told Peggy to hang on and play Tinkerbell on Penny too. She didn't have a bunch of neutral magic to balance out the sparkle magic, so it was harder to find the balance, but in the end I got it working. I didn't know how long it took for all this, maybe a half hour or so, but in the end both of my awake charms were feeling happy and back to normal. Penny now had more magic than she'd ever had before. Eggy wasn't anywhere near full, but he had more magic than he'd ever had with me. I linked all 3 of us together in mental communication and then sent out images catching them up on everything that had happened. It took a bit, but image communication is a lot faster than speaking, so they got a full overview pretty quickly. "Young source, you continue to surprise me," Eggy said in his normal formal tone. "I thought it would be at least 100 years before you could spare enough magic to get me back to full wakefulness. In all honesty, I thought it would take much longer, as I'm not your first charm or your only charm. You have an obligation to Penny also, so I thought I would rest for hundreds of years before I achieved my bliss. And yet, here it is only a short while later, and I feel fully awake and fully aware. I'm no longer in danger of going inert, and I have enough reserve to transform into my desired form. I truly thank you." His thoughts were much sharper and seemed to flow much faster than normal. I wasn't sure if that was because he had more magic or because of my mark. Either way, it was nice to feel the difference. "Well, I certainly appreciate your help freeing me and helping me fight the Necro Golem," I replied. "Without your help, I wouldn't be here today." In truth, I was tired of fading slowly, Eggy admitted. I hadn't talked to anyone in a very long time. I had many mages that held me, but they didn't speak to me. I was lonely and decided it was better to go out in one last moment of defense. It was most likely that you wouldn't be able to fulfill your promise, but I would no longer know or care. Now, however, I have my thoughts back again. I have a place to sit and someone to commune with. He and Penny buzzed back and forth in stone speak for a moment. "Truly, you have fulfilled your promise to me, which is why I am so ashamed to say I have not fulfilled my promise to you." I got a feeling of deep sadness and the image of scrap metal being tossed into a junk pile. "Whatever do you mean?" I asked, surprised. "You were going to sit and think on something, but I forgot what it is by now." I was going to sit and think on how you could win your fight, he replied, and sent image of the locker room before the match with the Centaur guard. Oh, that's right, I nodded. That fight is over, but there will be many more fights in the future, I'm sure. I always appreciate you thinking about how to keep me alive, but the final responsibility doesn't rest with you. He didn't seem convinced, and he was genuinely upset. He just admitted he'd basically decided to end his awareness the day he'd helped me, so I didn't want him doing anything drastic now. The last thing I wanted was for him to spend all his time sitting and thinking about how he thought he'd failed. That was terrible for people, and it couldn't be good for awakened charms either. Your sitting and thinking to help me is like me giving John advice on making a ring, I said quickly. I was making up this analogy as I went along, so hopefully it turned out well. Plus, I wanted to keep this earth and metal thing related. John, as the artist, might ask me to give him suggestions and ideas on stones and designs, but in the end it's up to him what he makes. I put ideas out there for him to mull over, and hopefully they get his creativity going. All that creativity has to come from him, though. What he makes is his design, his idea, his final product, and it may or may not be because of something I suggested. In the same way, you are helping me. You can suggest ideas and strategies for battle, or really anything I'm trying to do, but at the end of the day, I have to come up with my own strategies about what works for me. Your ideas and thoughts are always welcomed, but my success and failure doesn't depend on you alone. I could tell he was going to sit and think on that for a while, so I quickly diverted his attention. And we have come to the end of the chapter. So next time, what is our next one? It's Aggie's time. Nope, it's not. It's Rune Theory. For all you people who love the magic and love the stuff, this is a very exciting chapter. So, yeah. Aggie gets to say a few things, and that triggers some stuff for Jason, and then we end up with a unifying theory of runes, and oh my god, it's good. So anyway, so I'm very much looking forward to you hearing the next chapter. Okay, personal story, just for funs. So me and Harold were best friends for about 4.5 years before we started dating, and so I got to see him date a lot of people because he's a handsome guy, you know, or not date, well, date and, you know, bring back for the night. He had a cat at the time. He had 2 cats. One was Noah, and Noah was the most zen cat you've ever met in your whole life. Like he was wise, he was handsome, he was just zen. Caleb, on the other hand, the sun rose and set on Harold. Harold could do no wrong, and nobody else could do any right. So Harold was his little world. So when Harold brings somebody over, then Caleb didn't like them being in bed. And so he would wait until they were asleep, and then he would go over and take a nail and poke them until they got out of bed. So it took Harold a little bit. He was like, how come people wake up in the middle of the night and then just leave sometimes? I don't know. Yeah, so it was a lot of fun. So yeah, I had more than one fun cackle at that. But then, of course, once we started dating, then Caleb came over and tried to do that to me. And I was like, because we had already had 4.5 years of history. So I picked him up, took him into the living room, and we had a very serious talk together. You know, man to cat. And of course, you know, that went about what I expected, but at least at the end of the day, we ended up coming to an accord, and Caleb could sleep on his side of Harold and pretend I didn't exist, and I would sleep on my side of Harold and not touch Caleb at all, so that he could pretend that I wasn't there. Anyway, so I was thinking about that as I was writing this chapter, but anyway, it just popped back up in my head. So anyway, I hope that you have a wonderful Sunday, and I will see you guys next Sunday. Thank you.